truth. Y'all please join me in welcoming David Barton.
Thanks, guys. Thank y'all. Thanks. Let me start with just Josh. I'm supporting Josh. I've known Josh for a number of years. Josh is a really good guy. He's got a really good voting record. He's really strong in a lot of ways. And the fact that he's a nice guy is not good enough for being a congressman in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of nice people in Washington, D.C. that really don't vote all that well. And part of the reason I say this is you need a framework. You need to know who you're sending there and what they believe on a grid work, because in any given year in Washington, any given session of Washington, there's between 10 and 13,000 bills that are introduced, and there's usually about 1,000 votes every session. Now, if you think of what you've heard about in the news, you can maybe name 8 to 10 votes that have happened in that session. So there's a whole lot more than you know about. And so while a lot of people may get the big stuff right, they may sell you down the river with all the other stuff that you don't ever hear about. So you want someone who's got a grid work, a decision-making grid work that is consistent in a direction that you can be pretty confident that you're going to get the right results all the time. And when election time comes, again, they're going to find 5, 10, 15 votes and run on those 5, 10, 15 votes. There's 1,000 votes every session. And so there's a lot there. So I want to give you some grid work. I'll start by going to a founding father named Benjamin Rush. He's one of the 250 folks we call founding fathers. He's a signer of the Declaration, ratifier of the Constitution. John Adams said that of all the 250 or so founding fathers, Adams said the 3 most notable, number 1 is George Washington, number 2 is Ben Franklin, number 3 is Benjamin Rush. Now, don't know the guy today, and he's just not politically correct in a lot of ways. He's the founder of the first abolition society in America, led the first abolition society. He also started the Sunday school movement in America, started the first Bible society. He also started academic education for women, trained the first black physicians, started 5 universities. He's the greatest doctor in American history, called the father of American medicine. American Psychiatry Association still has his face on the logo. He's considered the father of psychiatry. He wrote the first chemistry textbook. I just keep going. The guy's unbelievable. Served in 3 different president administrations. And we have a lot of his writings. At Wall Builders, we own about 160,000 original documents from Columbus all the way through the modern era. I mean, we got all sorts of things. We just obtained another 1,400 documents out of the Pilgrim era, the time of the Pilgrims. So we have a massive collection of all these documents, and we own a lot of his handwritten documents, including his prayer journal. And his prayer journal, it's interesting, he is an open Christian man, and he is very thankful for many blessings he has, and he goes through those blessings. He lists them. He says, I'm thankful for this. And I was reading them, go check, yeah, got that one, yeah, that's a good one. And then he came to one that just really kind of set me back. He said, I thank God for all the times I have not fallen downstairs. Run that by me again. It seems like a strange one, but I'll just point out, I just ran up the stairs and didn't fall, and nobody noticed that. If you had noticed it, it would be because I fell, and that wouldn't be a good deal. See, there's so many things that don't happen to us in a day that are blessings, but we don't think about them because they don't happen. Like you go to the grocery store, you get groceries, you get back home, don't think about it. If you'd had a wreck, now you would have thought about that, but that's not the blessing. The blessing is things that you didn't notice. And as you think about blessing, it's like your health. You never think about your health until something happens to it, or your family until something happens, or your job until something happens. And so there's so many blessings, and I think that there's no other people in the world that take their blessings as much for granted as we do in the United States. And I think there's several reasons I can point to with that. If you take the Constitution, we have 5,800 years of recorded history. We have thousands of nations, thousands of constitutions. And significantly, Cornell University Law School said, what is the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? And so they looked and they wanted to answer that question, and they calculated all the countries, all the constitutions, and came back and said the average length of a constitution in the history of the world has been 17 years. May I point out that last September the 17th on Constitution Day, we had 234 years under the same document. See, we're so used to stability, we think stability is normal. We look at what happens in Ukraine and say, tis, isn't that bad? And yes, it is bad. But Ukraine, what's going on there is average. The average nation averages a violent revolution every generation, and a new constitution every 17 years. So what's happening with Ukraine and all the rest of the world, that's pretty typical. What's happening to us is not typical, and we're just so used to stability, we just assume everybody else has got it, and when we don't see stability, we think that's kind of strange. No, having stability is strange. And in addition to longevity that we have, if you look at things like our creativity, there's a number of ways to measure creativity, and if you want to make a global comparison, a good way to measure creativity is international copyright, international patent protection, because that transcends all the nations. America has 4% of the world's population. So 4% of the world's population should produce 4% of the world's whatever. It's interesting, America's 4% of the world's population has produced more than 96% of the inventions in the world. So, wow, that's a lot. See, we're so surrounded with luxuries and technologies and ease and convenience that we don't recognize how unusual that is. If you're in other nations, oh my goodness, and I've been in a number of nations for a number of reasons, and what we're used to here, what we take for granted, they consider blessings in other countries. And in addition to what we have, even with creativity, when you look at prosperity, the Constitution requires that every 10 years we do a census. The most recent census was in 2020. The results came out in 2021. And according to numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau, if you live below the poverty level in America, and we don't want anyone living in poverty in America, but according to the Census Bureau, if you live below poverty level in America, your lifestyle is higher than the middle class in Europe, which is the second wealthiest place on the face of the earth. You see, the World Bank sets the World Bank sets a global standard for poverty at $1,000 a year. That's the current standard for poverty. If you're in states like Hawaii, Mississippi, elsewhere, they specifically tell you unless you make more than $61,000 a year, you should not come off government services because that's what you get on government services. So that's the poor in America, and not everyone makes that level, but nonetheless, that's what we find across the nation. Nonetheless, the Census Bureau did document the level for poverty in America is higher than middle class in Europe. So we're blessed in a number of ways. This has been recognized by other nations. And by the way, we don't seem to recognize what other nations do. Everybody in the world is lined up at our border wants to live in poverty in America. If they can live in poverty here, they've elevated their lifestyle. I mean, that's how much they understand it. And way back in 1831, a Frenchman came to America. He toured here. He spent 8 months traveling. 4 years later, he wrote a book called Democracy in America, and he's the one who gave us the title American Exceptionalism. He said the conditions of the Americans is quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar position. So this is where we get the term American Exceptionalism, and contrary to what a lot of professors today will argue and say, oh, this is just pure arrogance. No, this is saying we're the exception, not the rule. This is not saying, look at us, we're special. This says we're exception. We're different from other nations, and that's American exceptionalism. So where did that come from? What philosophy produced that? And all we have to do is look at the writings of those who gave us the government, gave us our documents, gave us the things we enjoy. And the birth certificate of America, that Declaration of Independence, starts with a statement of principles. It goes through the statement of principles. It follows that with 27 grievances showing how the principles have been violated. And then it closes with a resolution clause that says, now, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge each other's our life, our fortune, our sacred honor. They're saying, we're telling the world, and this was a declaration prepared so that every other nation know what we're doing. Here's the principles we believe. And here's violations of those principles for Great Britain, which is why we're starting our own nation, and we're relying on God to do that. And we pledge everything we've got. So in that framework, let me show you the key philosophy that's central in the Declaration of Independence. The National Birth Certificate has 46 words that give 3 key principles. Let me just read those to you. Very simple. You'll know these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. 3 points stand out there. The first, notice they say these 3 immutable principles. They say all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator. Created, Creator. So there's a belief that there is a divine Creator. They believe that. They openly acknowledge that. Now, I've been involved in 13 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. Was involved in a case this year, already involved in a case next year at the Supreme Court. And in most of those cases, they deal somehow with religious expressions. And way back, now the court has started rolling back what it did in the 80s and 90s particularly. But way back at that point in time, the court said, you know, there's a lot of people here in America who don't believe in God, and we got a lot of different folks here, And government just can't take a position on whether there is or isn't a God. And so we're going to be neutral on that. And so that's what position was taken way back in what's called the limit test in 71. And that's the test that got struck down this year in the decision that dealt with Coach Kennedy. So the court said that limit test is gone. And by the way, we won a 9-0 decision this year dealing with Boston, and Boston City Hall refused to fly a Christian flag. They'd fly every other flag, not the Christian flag. And we won that decision 9-0, and Justice Breyer wrote the unanimous decision. The Justice Breyer is not considered conservative by anybody's standard, and yet Justice Breyer said, this is 9-0. He said, we're no longer in the freewheeling days of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And so the court has pulled itself back in from that activism it had. And at that time, when it had all that activism, is when it came up with this thing that says, well, we can't really acknowledge God. The founders didn't have any problem with that. They said this is the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Every political entity in America, we're all unanimous on this. There is a creator. Now, that didn't mean everybody in America had to believe in a creator, because we had a lot of atheists in America back then. We had a lot of deists in America back then. We had Muslims in America since 1619. We were building Hindu temples in 1800. We had all sorts of religions. We're not saying you have to come here and believe in God. We're just saying, hey, from the government standpoint, we believe there's a God. Now, there's a reason for this. The reason for this is they wanted limited government. That was what they designed. This is why Josh mentioned there's only 18 things the Constitution allows the federal government to do. Everything else is given to the states. Those are called the enumerated powers, so 18 powers. So they wanted a limited government, and they recognized the first step in having a limited government was acknowledging there's a God. You know, in their viewpoint, that limits government. How does that limit government? Because what happens is, if government thinks it is the source of everything, then it will have all power. And this is the problem with having health care as a right. If government can give it to you, government can take it away from you. Anything government gives, it can take away. So in a secular-minded government, which you see all over Europe, it's interesting to see the basic rights that most people consider today that don't exist. For example, if you're in Germany and want to homeschool your kids, forget it. The kids belong to the state. Parents who've homeschooled in Germany thrown in jail just in recent years because they homeschooled, because the children belong to the state. Now, that's not the way we see kids. We don't see that at all. And in the same way, if you want to share your faith in France, free speech, not in France. It's called proselytization. It is a crime. So you look across the secular nations of Europe, whether it is England, whether it is France, or whether it's Germany, or whether it's Italy or Morocco or Spain, and you don't see any level of rights close to the ones we enjoy here. And the belief is that when government thinks it is the ultimate power, it has all rights, and it will decide who gets them. Here in America, we want you to know that there is a God, and that makes you second tier. Government is below God, and so that's why they start with this acknowledgement. And I'll show you the expressions that they have with this and how clear it was. For example, if I take you to George Washington, on the same day we finished the Bill of Rights, George Washington issued a proclamation for the nation to stop and thank God. It's the first national proclamation calling for a day of prayer, time of prayer, and it was on the proclamation of the Bill of Rights. Now, this is the actual one. We own that actual one. And why would Washington call for us to stop and thank God? Here's what he said. He says, whereas it is the duty of nations, and by the way, notice the word duty. That's defined very differently than how we define it today. If you go back to their dictionaries, the word duty is defined as a legally binding contractual obligation. Today, if you look in the dictionary, it says a duty is that which one ought to do. Well, there's a big difference between what you ought to do and a legally binding contractual obligation. He said it's a legally binding contractual obligation of nations, he did not say individuals, of political entities, of nations, to do four things. It's a legally binding contractual obligation of nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. That is the duty of nations. So there's nothing secular in that statement. He said this is what political entities do. Now, doesn't mean everyone's required to believe in God. Again, we give freedom here. But from a standpoint, we want government to know that it's not the top dog in the pile. It's down under, and therefore it does not have unlimited power. It has to have restrained power. So that's the first step they had in the philosophy. The second step is after there's a divine creator, they next say they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, this is the concept that certain rights come from God. There are God-given inalienable rights. Again, God is first, government is second. And this concept of God-given inalienable rights, this they saw as a second step in having limited government. Now, why is that? Let me give you an example. Cowboy from Texas, have a ranch out in south of Lawton. In our ranch, I have a red pickup, and I've had a red pickup for several generations of pickups. I really like red pickups. It's a color I like a lot. My son has a pickup as well, and he came and drove on the ranch, and he has a black pickup, and that's not a good deal. So I promptly spray painted his black pickup red because everybody needs a red pickup. No, I didn't. Why? Because I can't spray paint something I don't own. Anything I own, I can spray paint red. I can spray paint my house red. I can spray paint my pastures red, my roads red, anything I want. But I can't spray paint red what doesn't belong to me. And this is essentially the other statement of government. There's a certain set of rights you can't spray paint red. They don't belong to you, and you can't regulate them, and you can't do anything with them because they didn't come from you. What came from you, you can regulate. What didn't come from you, you can't. Give you a definition of inalienable rights because we don't talk about it much. Founding fathers used both the words inalienable and by the way, that's the concept of jurisdictions. There are certain things that belong from God that you can't touch. What comes to you, you can regulate. So the concept of inalienable rights, that's a term we don't often use, inalienable, and they also use the term unalienable. They're both the same in the dictionary, in their dictionaries in that day. And if you look at them, what is an inalienable right? Well, the guys who wrote the documents tell us. For example, John Dickinson, who's a signer of the Constitution, as well as one of the guys who helped with the Declaration. John Dickinson, he said, inalienable right is a right which God gave to you and which no inferior power has a right to take away. So if God gave it to you, it's off limits to any government. And see, this is their jurisdictional thing. There's certain rights. Not every right comes from God, but the ones that do, government can't take from you. You have the same thing with Alexander Hamilton, who said it this way. He said, inalienable rights are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They're written, as with a sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of the divinity itself and can never be erased or obscured by any mortal power. John Adams, same kind of thing. John Adams says, inalienable rights are antecedent to all earthly governments. They're rights that cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws. They're rights derived from the great legislator of the universe. The Founding Fathers in their writings identify roughly 22, 23, 24, they group them sometimes differently, about 24 rights that did not come from government, and therefore government cannot regulate those rights. So what would those rights be? Well, if you go to the Declaration of Independence, which is where they first talk about it in a government document, Sam Adams, who's called the father of the American Revolution, he said, well, in the Declaration, we told you that among others were these. And this is what Sam pointed out. He said, we told you that among others, there's first a right to life, secondly to liberty, thirdly to property, together with the right to defend them. Life, liberty, property, and self-defense. Those are 4 inalienable rights. That's what we mentioned in the Declaration. And he said that those were among others. So 11 years later, after we've won the Declaration, after we've written the Constitution, we've added the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights said, remember, we told you there were others. Here's some of the others. So the First Amendment has 5 inalienable rights. The Second Amendment has 2 inalienable rights. The Third Amendment has 1. The Fourth through the Eighth Amendments have about a dozen inalienable rights in those. As you go through the Bill of Rights, you'll find close 18, 19 amendments, and then the ones we had in the Declaration as well. So there's about 24 inalienable rights that government's not to touch, not to regulate, not to mess with, and that's why they set it up the way they did. So that's the second concept, is there is a God. He gives certain rights to man that government is not to regulate. And the third thing they pointed out was that to secure these rights. Which rights? These rights, inalienable rights. We just told you. This is the next sentence. That to secure these inalienable rights, governments are instituted among men. Now, what you get there is they say that the primary purpose of government is to protect inalienable rights. Well, I thought it was to protect the border. I thought it was to make sure everybody had a job, good economy. That comes later. First thing is we make sure that you have the right to practice your God-given rights, and then past that, we'll work on the border, we'll work on jobs, whatever else. So, excuse me, that's the concept they had. And Sam Adams, again, going back to Sam, he explains this. He says, government was originally designed for the preservation of the inalienable rights. Now, he said, now remember what they were. First, right to life. Second, to liberty. Thirdly, to property. That right to life is interesting because people have said for a long time, oh, there's a right to life in the Declaration. Some guys say, well, we don't take an oath to uphold the Declaration. We take an oath to uphold the Constitution. Good for you. Did you notice that Article 7 of the Constitution dates itself to the Declaration? The Constitution does not start a new numbering system. Even today, as the President signs bills, they're dated to the Declaration, not to the Constitution. Founding Fathers said very clearly those two documents are not separated. The U.S. Supreme Court for decades said those two documents can't be separated. The Declaration gives the value system, and the Constitution gives the operation within that value system. So the Constitution, the Declaration, right to life. So they're saying first is a right to life. Well, the thought was, hey, if they meant right to life, this could have been argued with Roe v. Wade back in 73. But obviously, that's not what they were talking. They weren't talking about abortion that day when they said right to life. They had a different meaning. That's what you hear, but that's really kind of a crazy argument. Right to life, first thing, right to life. See this book? This is a book we have on abortion in America, 1808. Now, I can take you back earlier than that, but this is, we've gone back through, searched all the legal documents back in the day. Let me just give you an example. In 1779, when Jefferson became governor of Virginia, he implemented a ban on abortion in Virginia. They already had it, but now he's a governor, and we're no longer a British colony. Now we need our own American laws. And so Jefferson, as part of the 1779 Legal Code of Virginia, bans abortions in Virginia in 1779. This guy here, this is James Wilson. James Wilson is one of 6 guys who signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. He's the second most active member at the Constitutional Convention. He is put on the original Supreme Court by George Washington. He starts the first law school in America. And in 1791, while he's on the Supreme Court, he's teaching law school, doing both. We actually have the original works from law school. It's a 3-volume set that he did for students on his lectures. And in that, he talks about the fact that in America, abortion is not allowed. This is part of the inalienable natural rights. And he goes through abortion. By the way, this should not be a surprise to anyone, because as long as people have been pregnant, there are people who didn't want to be pregnant. Even the Old Testament, back in Leviticus elsewhere, talks about protecting unborn children. This is nothing new. All that's changed with abortion is the way that you do it. The technology has changed, not the fact that it's happened for literally millennia in history. So James Wilson, in his law books, talks about it. Even this man, this is the president of Princeton University. This man, John Witherspoon, is a signer of the Declaration, but he also trained about 1/3 of the Founding Fathers. He has a lecture that he gave at Princeton. And in that lecture, he said, there's a big difference between America and Europe. He said in Europe, they think that parents give life to children. And so in Europe, they allow abortions. He said, here in America, we don't believe that parents give life to children. We think God gives life to children. And so we don't abort babies because that life comes from God, not the parents. And he said, that's a big difference between America and Europe. Now, these guys are talking about abortion back there. And this last week, Senator Mazie Hirono from Hawaii said, we just really can't know what the Founding Fathers wanted with abortion. So the court has no business giving it back to the states because we just don't have any idea what they wanted. Yes, we do. That's why there's so many cases on it. That's why it's in so many law books. It's not that hard. But a lot of people do not study history, and they don't like what they find, and so they ignore what they disagree with. Nonetheless, that's in history. So you go back to this thing. First is a right to life. And the word that's significant to me here is first, because this tells me something about the worldview of anyone running for office. If someone comes to me and wants me to help them run for office or endorse or whatever, first thing I want to know is where they are in life. Because if you give me anybody running for office, and I don't know, maybe there's a U.S. Senate race in Montana. I haven't checked. Let's play like there is. And there's a candidate running for U.S. Senate for Montana. If you will tell me that candidate's position on the life issue with a 90% degree of certainty, I will tell you where they are on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, on the Small Arms Treaty. I'll tell you where they are on the Paris Accords, virtually anything at all. You tell me where they are in life within a 90% degree of certainty, I will tell you how they're going to vote on capital gains tax. I'm going to tell you how they'll vote on extending all sorts of, it's easy stuff. And there's a lot of proof to this as well. If I take you, for example, you'll find that if a person is wrong on the life issue, they're generally wrong on First Amendment issues of religious expression. You can't have a coach pray at a football game. Are you kidding? Well, that ought to be free speech even if it wasn't religious expression. But generally, when a person is wrong on the life issue, they're not very good on public religious expressions, even though the First Amendment expressly guarantees that. Generally, if they're not good on the Life Amendment, they're really not very good on the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. They're usually wrong on that one. Usually, if they're not good on the life issue, they're usually not good on property issues. About 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, the U.S. Supreme Court came back in a decision. It's called the Takings Clause in the Constitution. The government has the right to take property before he has to reimburse. But they said, well, taking used to mean public use. We now think public purpose is more accurate. So we're going to reinterpret Takings Clause for public purpose, which now means that if the government looks at your house and says, you know what, we would get a lot more tax revenue, not from your house, but if we tore your house down and built a strip mall here and had 6 shops here, we'd get more tax revenue. They can now take your house and your property for public use, public purpose, not just public use. So usually if they're wrong on the life issue, they're going to be wrong on protecting private property. In the same way, they often are wrong on issues of traditional institutions, values, genders, how many genders there are. As a matter of fact, this last week there was corporate training, and the trainers pointed out that there are currently 150 genders in America. 18 months ago, when the movement was in the state of Texas working on health standards, at that time they identified 93 genders. Now it's 150 genders. So the traditional measurements are not going to be the same. Everything revolves around that life issue. You can pretty well predict where everyone is on it. So those are granted are social issues, and there's a lot of people who don't care anything at all about social issues. All they care about is economic issues. Okay, if that's what you care about, there's a lot of those to look at. I mean, there's certainly a lot of stuff going on with economics that we can talk about. We see what's happening in the country. Significantly, with what's happening on economic issues, there's a lot of ways to measure economic issues. There's as I mentioned, 10 to 13,000 bills introduced every session. There's 1,000 votes every session. And there are pro-life groups that will monitor all the pro-life bills. There are economic groups that monitor all the economic votes. All different groups have different issues for what they look at. So if you look at economic issues or life issues, let me just give an example. Susan B. Anthony List is one of the large national groups that measures how congressmen, House and Senate vote on abortion and life issues. So if you take the House of Representatives, every year they come out with a scorecard on the best life representatives through the worst. They'll rank them from 1 all the way through 435, and over in the Senate, 1 through 100. So if you look at the best life representatives this year, this is the current list that came out this year, and these are all Congress people that scored 100% on pro-life issues. Now, let's say that life is not your thing, you're concerned about economics. Well, if that's the case, if you want to see who the best economic reps are, what you need to do is check the scorecards of groups like Americans for Prosperity, because they don't care a whit about life or marriage or anything else. They just care about taxes and about people being able to keep their money, etc. And if you look at their scorecard, it's interesting that it's a 1-to-1. The best life people are also the best economic people. Now, they don't care about the economic, they don't care about the life issues, but one is a good indication of the other. Because, see, and by the way, here's on the worst side, the worst life representatives, these are the ones that get the zeros, and if you look at the economic stuff, it's real close to the same. These are the bottom scores on the economic stuff, so real close. It's like a 1-to-1 correlation. If you're bad on life, you'll be bad on economics, and other way around. So this is a good indicator. It's a good scorecard all the way through, and it makes sense, because if they won't protect your life, why would they protect your money? Your life is more important than your money, and if they're not going to protect your life, why would they protect something less important? And so that is a good indicator of where things are. Now, with Josh, this is something we know where he is because he has a voting record. He was 8 years in the state Senate, and that means a whole lot of votes, and Oklahomans for Life watched him, and they gave him 100% ranking. So he's good on life. He's already been tested, and that means he's been through, usually a state legislature has 3,000 to 5,000 bills a session. So Josh, in 8 years, is going to have 20, 30,000 bills he's gone through. So he's been tested on a lot of stuff. And so I may know where he is on 5 or 6 big issues, but now I know where he is on a whole bunch of other issues as well, because he's got that track record that I can look at and see exactly where he is. So going back to Sam Adams, first is a right to life. And that doesn't matter what's economic or social issues, but when you look at these 3 things that we have in the Declaration, the first is that, all right, there is a divine creator. The second is inalienable rights come from God. And the third is that government should protect God-given inalienable rights. It's interesting, all 3 of those things are God-centered. In other words, they're not secular ideas. These are based around the fact that God exists and God gives us certain rights, and government should protect our God-given rights. That concept, that's why secular government doesn't work well. It tends to be big, it tends to be intrusive, it tends to get into all sorts of affairs of people, it tends to micromanage all sorts of stuff. I thought it was significant that Jerry Nadler, who is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, earlier this year when some of this argument was being brought up about God-given rights, and that's where Judiciary, there's a committee that deals with what rights are protected and not. Jerry Nadler, as he pointed out, he said, God's will is of no concern to this Congress. Yeah, probably isn't to this Congress, which is why we've seen a lot of the changes we've seen. And right now, people aren't liking the way Congress and the administration is heading. We just finished some massive national polling 2 days ago, released those results. It's one of the larger polls done in the last several years. Covered 48 values of Americans, covered all the demographics, all the age groups, the 5 generations, Gen X, Y, Z, boomers and busters, went through as a massive number. It's 2% error on the poll. And it's interesting that Congress is out of step with where most of the people are, 72% of the people. And that's why Biden right now is upside down in 47 of the 50 states. And upside down means that those who disapprove of him, the number is higher than those who approve of him. So they're talking about maybe 70 seats changed this year in Congress. Some of the polling we've seen shows that it may be more than 100 seats in Congress. Who knows? We won't know until it gets there because people really haven't started spending money yet. Money changes a lot of people's thinking in a lot of areas. But there's something going on where that Congress is not really, people aren't really getting behind Congress and where they're headed. They're not getting behind the president where he wants to head. And so they're wanting to see some protection for these rights. Now, that's one grid. And I mentioned there's a couple of grids I want to expose you to. The other is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, when he was president of the United States, he was a guy who talked a lot about limited government. And limited government he considered to be good government, but it needed to be limited government. And so what happens is you look at Jefferson on good government, in his inaugural address, he gave an interesting grid on how you can know whether government's good or not. It's this portion right here. That's the first printing of his inaugural address, Washington, March the 1st, 1801. That part right there, I want to read you what he said. Jefferson said, "After acknowledging and adoring and overruling Providence, what more is necessary to make us a happy and prosperous people?" He said, "Still one thing more, a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, which shall leave them free to otherwise regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and which shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government." Now notice what he listed there. He says, first, he says you start with acknowledging and adoring a divine providence. So first thing he started with is exactly what Washington started with, is what they put in the Declaration. He's the chief author of the Declaration. He says, after you've acknowledged and adored God, what else do you need to have good government? So you start with acknowledge and adore God. The second thing he points out is you need to exercise frugality. This is one of his statements on that. He says, "I place economy among the first and most important of Republican virtues, and public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared." Now, public debt as the greatest of dangers to be feared, if he's right about that, then we got a lot of stuff to fear. I mean, it is through the roof. It's about $30 trillion right now, but that's only an actual, the actual debt. As you look at debt liabilities, we funded Medicaid and Medicare and all these things out in the future. It's about $190 trillion as you look out in the future. So if every one of us were to say, you know, I want the government out of debt, I'm going to ante up right now, it's about $170,000 a person to pay off the $30 trillion. But if we say, you know, I want to pay off for my grandkids too, I don't want my grandkids inheriting all that debt, we're looking at about $900,000 in American. So to get that debt retired, we're all going to have to contribute a lot more than we want to individually, unless the government can, you know, they can keep printing money, but that doesn't mean anything. That's part of what helps lead to inflation. So you're looking at a change that's happened in the way we think just in recent decades. Part of this is called modern monetary theory. It was introduced back in 1934. It's part of what FDR ran on. And modern monetary theory, the belief is that spending increases prosperity. So the more you spend, the more people prosper with that. But that doesn't take into account debt. And so the government is spending a whole lot, and their belief is, well, that creates inflation, but you handle inflation by controlling supply and demand. And this is what Roosevelt did back in the day. And that's why the only real action you're seeing now toward controlling inflation in America is let's redefine inflation, then it won't be inflation anymore. But there's not an effort to cut spending, and there's not an effort to slow inflation because of modern monetary theory. Now, some of that comes later. So if Jefferson is right that debt is the greatest of dangers to be feared, we've had a whole lot of debt that's happened in recent decades. It's not good. Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. Debt is bad. We don't run our families this way. We don't run our businesses this way. It doesn't matter who the president is. That's not a good deal. From a biblical standpoint, Proverbs 22:7 says that the borrower is servant to the lender. Essentially, if I have a paycheck that I get on Fridays and I don't have any debt, I've got a lot of freedom. I can do what I want with my money. But if I got debts, I got to pay the mortgage, and I got to pay the car, and I got to pay the school loan, and I don't have a whole lot of money left for my own freedom or what I want to do. So debt reduces freedom. That's the way the Founding Fathers always saw it. That's the way the Bible teaches it, that the borrower is servant to the lender. The banks control me and tell me what I'm going to do with the money I earn because I'm in debt to them. And so that's not where we want to be. Debt is a bad deal. That's always a traditional belief. Again, with modern monetary theory, progressives have headed in a different direction on that. It hasn't proven itself yet, but it's been tried now in two major eras of American history. So, continuing on, Jefferson says, to preserve the independence of the people, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. He says, we must make our choice between frugality and liberty or excessive spending and servitude. Notice the choice. If you practice frugality, you're going to have a liberty. If you get into excessive spending, you're going to have servitude. That's that Bible verse. If you stay out of debt, you got liberty. If you get into debt, you're into servitude. He continues, he says, if the debt should be swelled to a formidable size, its entire discharge will be despaired of, and we should be committed to a career of debt, corruption, and rottenness. The discharge of the debt, therefore, is vital to the destinies of our government. So this is a big deal. What's the economic view of the person you send? What are they thinking about debt? Is debt something that you have to get rid of, or it's something we have to tolerate? We have to learn to live with the new standard. We have to learn. What's the idea? I know where Josh is because he got voting records when he was here in the legislature. So this is part of the second framework that I'm talking about. The first one's out of the Declaration. The third thing Jefferson said was you also need to restrain the infliction of injury. Now this is the one we got involved in a Supreme Court case about 5 years ago. It's called overcriminalization. Here's where it stems from. If I take you back to the Bible says in 1 Timothy 8:10 that we know the law is good if it's used as it should be used. And it goes on to say law is made to restrain the bad guys, not the good guys. It says murderers and perjurers and goes through and lists them all. And that's the way the law is supposed to be handled. It's supposed to go after the bad guys, not the good guys. It hasn't worked out that way. You all know that you're responsible for the law, even if you don't know what it is. I'm from Texas. Our speed limit 85 across the border. So I come in here driving 85, and I'm going to get pulled over because it's not 85 coming up the interstate. And I'm going to say to the officer, I didn't know it was 85. It's 85 in Texas. He's going to say, well, you should have known the law before you came in. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. That is the idiom that's used. So we should know the law, and you ought to know the U.S. Federal Code. So here's the deal. According to USA Today, if you will read 700 pages a week of the Federal Code, you can finish the entire Federal Code in only 25,000 years. This is what resulted in some attorneys writing the book. It's called Three Felonies a Day. There are 4,500 federal felonies right now, and on average, every one of you commit 3 felonies a day. Now, you don't know about it because you haven't read all those laws, but if the government ever wants to come after you, oh yeah, it'll be able to take you down because you're committing 3 felonies a day without even knowing it, and ignorance of the law is no excuse. So we no longer regulate just the bad guys, we're regulating the heck out of the good guys. And we do that through several different ways, and we may get into some of that later. But nonetheless, the purpose of law is just to restrain the infliction of injury. Just stop the bad guys from hurting others. And that's not what law does anymore. The fourth thing Jefferson said was encourage entrepreneurship and free enterprise. Encourage business growth. Encourage individual action. This is the way Franklin explained it. Ben Franklin said, a free market is the means under God of establishing the freedom of our country entire and handing it down complete to posterity. Now, he said under God. What in the world does that mean? You're going to find numerous founding fathers said under God because they knew American history much better than we do. It's interesting that if you're an economics major or you've been in economics courses at college, you're often told that, well, the father of modern economics is Adam Smith. He wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and that's the beginning of the free market system. No, America had the free market system in place in 1627. Pawtucket, Massachusetts is the first place where the free market went into effect. You find out how it went into effect by reading the writings of William Bradford. The early groups that came to America were all socialists. They came here. The king had provided everything. They're used to the king providing everything. They work for the king. They give it to the king. The king gives back to them what they need. And so as they got here, that was the way they had a very communitarian approach. And so they took all of their production from a year, put it together, and they would split it with everybody. And then William Bradford said, the Bible was a new book to us. We'd gone through the Reformation, which is back to the Bible period. For about 1,000 years in world history, the Bible was put up only for elites. You had state-established churches who told everybody what they had to believe and how they had to behave. No use reading the Bible because it doesn't matter what it says. We're going to do what the church leaders say or we're going to lose our heads. We're going to go through an inquisition, go through our tortures, whatever. And so at that point in time, once you get to the Reformation, now people start having a Bible for themselves. And the Pilgrims brought to America what's called the Geneva Bible, the first Bible printed in English in America, or printed in English in the Western world. And so they bring that to America, and they spent, according to Governor Bradford, they spent several hours a day in the Bible. And he said that they came across a Bible verse 1 Timothy 5:8 that says, if you don't provide for your own household, you're worse than an infidel. You've denied the faith. He said, whoa, we're providing for everybody else. Read that again. If you don't provide for your own household, he said, all right, that's what we're doing. We're providing for our own household. And so suddenly everyone responsible for making what their family needed, he said that in the first year, production went up sevenfold. They measured 7 times as much production that came in because people started working for themselves. And when that happened, that leads to prosperity for sure. And that's when the colony never had another time of drought and poverty after that point in 1627 where they started working for themselves. You'll find the other colony, Jamestown, had the same problem. They went through what was called the starving time. In 1 year, the population of Jamestown went from 450 down to 90. It's called the starving time because they starved to death because they wouldn't work. Matter of fact, you find in the records of Jamestown that they actually raided the cemeteries, dug up dead bodies looking for meat on the bodies that they could eat. One man killed his pregnant wife, ate the child, ate the wife. It was bad times. And Governor John Smith rolled out 2 Thessalonians 3:10 where it says, if you don't work, you don't eat. He said, that's the new rule. You don't work, you don't eat. Suddenly, everybody had an incentive to work, and that's how they survived what was called the starving time. So as you go through, you'll find that in history, there were 5 Bible verses that built the free market system. 1 Thessalonians 5:8, 1 Timothy 5:8, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Matthew 25, Luke 19, and Matthew 20. Those 5 verses created the economic system that we have long before you had anything with Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. So historically, that's what you go back to. And Jefferson, the Founding Fathers, encouraged this. You'll also see Thomas Jefferson says this. He says, the pillars of our prosperity are the most thriving when left most free to individual enterprise. If you can keep government out of our necks, then we'll be able to produce a lot more. You have the same thing with so many other Founding Fathers. So that's his 4th point. The 5th point he made was protect the property and earnings of citizens. Significant that they did not believe the government had the right to take your income because that is your labor, that is your work, that is your property. If you have money, you earn that. And so we had to amend the Constitution in 1913 through the 16th Amendment for the government to be able to take your income because up to that, we raised monies off excise, tariffs, taxes. It's kind of like the conversation Jesus and Peter had in the scriptures where Jesus said to Peter, Peter, who pays the taxes in a nation? Is it the children of the nation or the foreigners in the nation? Peter said, that's easy. It's the foreigners. Children don't pay the taxes. Well, that was the way things went. You had excises, imports, all the things that we do with other nations sending stuff, and we would tax that, but we didn't tax the citizens like that. There were local taxes and others, but not in the sense of direct taxation. We have to amend the Constitution to do that. So protecting the property and earnings of citizens, they considered your earnings to be part of your property. You have James Madison who expresses it this way, government is instituted to protect property. That included earnings as well. He said, where it is not a just government, nor is property secure under it, where arbitrary restrictions deny to part of its citizens that free use of their faculties, or where the property which a man has in his personal safety and personal liberty is violated by arbitrary seizures of one class of citizens for the service of the rest. What you have, what you earn, what you possess, if that's not protected, we got trouble. Jefferson said the same thing. He says, to take from one because it's thought that his own productivity is acquired too much, in order to give to others who have not exercised equal industry and skill, is to violate arbitrarily the first principle of association, the guarantee to everyone of a free exercise of his hard work and the profits acquired by it. I busted my tail to make stuff for me and not to make stuff for the guy down the street. And that's my incentive to work harder because the harder I work, the more I can produce for my family. Everybody's got that same incentive. And if they don't work, they don't eat. See, that was the free market system back then. It rewarded productivity. It didn't spread your productivity to people who weren't productive. It was just real simple. Now, we had charity, and real simple. We really did good on charity. Scripture's really good about that. Orphans, widows, those that can't provide for themselves. We took care of those people always. But it's the hard-working people like Jamestown had that weren't working, and they're taken from others. That's the stuff they focus on. You also have Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin said, there cannot be a stronger natural right than that of man's making the best profit he can. And now we're the mindset that, oh, you make too much. We need to take it away from you and give it to others who don't make as much. What's the incentive? That's where productivity has always gone down historically and globally. So the sum of good government, according to Jefferson, respect God, exercise frugality, punish criminals, not the good people, punish the criminals, encourage free enterprise, and then protect citizens' property and income. That's the second grid. Anybody you elect to office ought to have those two grids. The declaration grid, 3 points. There is a God who gives us rights, and government exists to protect those rights, inalienable rights, and we want limited government, which means we respect God again. We exercise frugality, punish criminals, encourage free enterprise, protect citizens' property and income. You send a person like that to office, then you've got something to work with, because you're not going to be there to monitor most of the votes that Josh makes when he's in Congress. You want a framework of ideas that will work for that. So you look at Josh, it starts with life first. We've got his record on where that is. I know where his economics are going to be. I know where his regulatory policies will be. I know where all that's going to be because I know where he is on that. Plus, I've got a voting record of 8 years. In addition to that, you want to elect someone that you don't have to lobby. This is one of the... You want someone who holds the same values you do so that you don't worry about him losing those values when he gets somewhere else. It's people who don't really have convictions and core beliefs that squish around a lot, and it's hard to know where they are, and you get surprised when you see their voting record. I can't believe he went there and voted like that. So this is where you want to know who you elect, and if you don't have to lobby that person. And I'll just say I've got a good friend who's a state rep. He's now a state senator. He was in the House for 22 years. And a lot of states now are very sophisticated in how they lobby against abortion. We would get texts, we would get emails said, hey, today at 2:30 in committee, they're going to have a hearing on SB 327, and you need to contact your legislator and tell them to vote no on Amendment 4 and Amendment 7. I mean, very sophisticated. There's even things that said, if you'll punch here, we'll call them for you and tell that, so very easy. In 22 years, with all the stuff that went on with Roe v. Wade, I never called him one time on any pro-life bill because I know where he was on life issues. I recruited him for office. I know what he believed. It was life first. I never had to bother him about that. I always watched and I always kept up. But it's the kind of thing you want to elect people you don't have to lobby. And so I never had to bother him on those issues because I knew where he was. So elect is the big thing. As you know, the runoff is coming up on the 23rd. And when you get into a runoff, the turnout for a runoff is usually about the same as a local election, which runs about 6%, which means just a handful of people can turn this thing in a significant direction. So not only do you need to vote, you need to go find 43 of your closest friends and get them to vote as well, because this is all about turnout when you get to this point. So God bless you guys, and